Hello, I'm Richard Else, and I'm sorry that the current COVID-19 restrictions prevent us meeting physically. I hope you're all managing to stay safe, and I hope this virtual gathering will be a decent substitute and will take you out of your current environment to somewhere that's become a very important part of my life. My presentation is about a remarkable Scotsman, an equally inspiring monk, and some of the world's greatest mountains. But just before we start that journey together, I thought it might be useful if I said just a few words about myself. I'm a filmmaker, a writer, photographer, and for the last 16 years I've run BBC Scotland's adventure show. I'm also an academic, particularly interested in social inclusion and social justice. And for many years, I thought those two parts of my life were really quite separate, but in a way they're not. They're all about people giving people a voice, especially those who are marginalised or those who struggle to get heard in what, sometimes at least, seems an increasingly noisy world. A monk, a Scotsman and the mountains is the title of my presentation, and how all three came together is an incredibly lucky accident of fate and chance. So, in reverse order, the mountains are those surrounding the village of Fortsey, 3,840 metres high up in the Khumbu region of Nepal, just off the trekking route to Everest base camp. Then there's a monk. Tashi Lama comes from the village, but his monastery is in nearby Tengboche. And the Scotsman, well, he's James Lamb, and someone who feels as much at home trekking amongst the mountains of Nepal as he does here in Scotland. I could spend a good deal of this presentation explaining how James and Tashi met following an accident on Everest in 2014 when tragically 12 Sherpas lost their life in an avalanche. James was in Nepal at the time, and he wanted to do more than simply make a donation. As a result of a chance meeting with Tashi, and with neither speaking the other's language, they formed a charity to help the people of Fortsey. They called it the Little Sherpa Foundation. It's transforming many lives, but of equal importance, at least in my view, is the relationship James has built up between himself and the people in the village. James will be taking part in our live discussion at the end of my talk, so you'll be able to find out more about this shortly. Initially, James asked me if I'd like to document the work he and Tashi were undertaking.
Okay, enjoy. Okay. Oh no, you're welcome, you're welcome.
At that time, I didn't know we'd be leaving Nepal literally when the earthquake of 2015 struck and changed thousands of lives forever. And I certainly didn't expect that 4 years later I'd be helping the Sherpas to tell their story to people around the world. And this is it, the village of Fortsey. You fly into Lukla, a flight not recommended if you're especially nervous, and then it's a leisurely 4-day acclimatisation trek up through the busy and ever-expanding Nanchid Bazaar and then onwards to Fortsey itself. Anthropologists once described this as the most traditional village in all of the Khumbu, and some of that still remains. There are tea houses, the Nepalese equivalent of B&B, but tourism isn't the dominant force it is in other local communities. And the village of Fortsey is home to 450 people. Almost all of them are Sherpas. As I mentioned earlier, I first visited the village in 2015 and met the villagers there. They're a remarkable set of individuals. They not only have fascinating life stories, but they offer a very different view to the traditional one that's often portrayed about Sherpas in the mainstream media. So often we're told about the incredible mountaineering exploits of Sherpas, almost as if they enjoy high altitude climbing and do it solely for pleasure. The reality, sadly, is very different, and it's this different reality I'm keen to explore. The Sherpas of Fortsey all tell the same story. It's lack of employment opportunities that drive many of them to work in very dangerous situations as high altitude porters and guides. And it's work that can come at a terrible cost.
I go to the expeditions, my wife are so sad because mountains life is very dangerous. If I go to the mountain and if I get an accident, they get a big problem. In the Sherpa community, they have an uneducated. That's why they have a pressure to go to the high mountains for earn the money.
She doesn't want her husband to go to climbing, but he doesn't listen to her. So she's worried about him all the time. Soon he leave from home. Inside her mind is always worried and always thinking about him. She said it's about the same feeling for every woman from this village.
I need to go to the mountain because I take care of my parents, take care of my family. In the Nepal government have no good opportunity about the job. That's why I need to go to the mountain.
Sometimes she get big argument because she told the husband don't go, and he said, if I didn't go expedition, how the money come from? We need the money.
I was staggered to learn that from this small village, over 60 climbers have summited Everest, sometimes as many as 16 times, and sadly 11 have died on the mountain. And as you've just seen, this can cause tension within a family, especially when you discover, as I did, that not every Sherpa is insured. So an accident can not only be a catastrophic event within the family, but it can also lead to extreme poverty. The first films I made in Fortsey were shown on the BBC, but last year, thanks to a generous, anonymous corporate donor, we were able to do something I'm passionate about, to allow the people there to tell their own story rather than have one imposed upon them by the media. James and I spent a month in the village in February and March last year, and it was pretty cold then, -25 in our bedrooms some evenings. Certainly concentrates the mind when you're trying to get in and out of a sleeping bag. We wanted to give the Sherpas of Fortsey a chance to tell their own story and for them to explain the underlying issues they face. One of the most respected people in the village, and someone I've got to know really well, is Pemberita Sherpa, and he became our window into Fortsey, its people, their homes, and perhaps most importantly, the culture and the life that they're trying to preserve.
So we have really cold winter, approximately 20 degrees cold at night at Fahrenheit. All the water gets froze, so I take out my ice axe, chopping all the ice, break the ice, and we went to the stream to get water, carry it to house and start fire and make a cup of tea for that. Everybody's dreaming about the running water at their house for a long time. Getting up in the morning is really hot. We don't have heating system in the house, so we don't have much firewood even. So we are collecting all the yak dungs, dry out, and we make a fire. But a lot of older people has a really hard time.
I was astonished to discover that in spite of a harsh lifestyle, Fortsey has a large number of elderly people. Shering Lamu is 93, the same age as my mother was at the time. She's one of the village's oldest residents. She's fiercely independent and lives a life that few tourists and trekkers get to see.
This is for like a chimney. The smokes go out, but in the winter, once the wind and wind comes, snow brings all the snow inside the house, and sometimes you can see all the snow cover inside the house. So she's tried to block this chimney because there's a lot of snow coming in. So if she puts some plastic and some old clothes, put it in the hole. She's 93-year-old. She cannot get water by herself. But sometimes I saw she's getting water from the stream, but she has a 5 liters she's carrying up by herself. I saw one day, which is very difficult for her to bring it up to her house. She used all the clothes to wear and keep warm all the time.
Amagadi ta Portugal bigasho loti gupchulebi 90
My grandma is one of the oldest person in the village, and because she's old, she cannot get up super early. After the sunrise, she gets up and she builds a fire and she makes tea by herself. And during the day, she go to collect some firewood and bring it home and make some dinner by herself. It's a little bit hard for her now.
I don't know if you noticed, but Tashi Lama was carrying a red package for his grandmother. In fact, it's a duvet I managed to get and to give to her. Yet in spite of the cold she was experiencing at the time, she didn't use it the first night I gave it to her. She explained to me it was an inauspicious day in the Buddhist calendar, so she'd wait another night before unwrapping it. Tashi Lama is also key to this story. For 18 years he was a monk in the nearby Tengbochi monastery, but as monks have no financial support, he's come back home and is starting a tea house. And coming back home is significant. Many young people are drawn by the pull of Kathmandu, both to continue their education or to quite simply get a job. So Fortsi is a village fighting to preserve its past whilst also planning for the future.
In our village, our community is quite strong to follow the generation and generation how to preserve our tradition. We also have a really good unit for working together. Everybody listen to each other, and we don't want to lose our strong culture. We are really quite strong about how to preserve our fuel, protecting our crops, and we have a lot of things we still follow.
And that leads, and I hope quite neatly, into the structural issues facing Fortsi and the Sherpas who live there. When I mentioned that many people, particularly the young, are pulled towards Kathmandu, I wasn't simply thinking of the issues that face many, perhaps even most, of the remote rural communities around the world. The problems in Nepal for the Sherpas and these high mountain villagers are more deep-seated and structural. Here's just a few examples. The head teacher of the local school is a government appointee. He's not a Sherpa and he can't speak their language. As a result of this, numbers are falling as parents who can afford it send their children away to school. And still thinking about education, I met many young people who simply don't have the money to go on to higher education, although they'd be well qualified to do so. And earlier, I mentioned that Fortsey has a number of older residents, but people are now starting to die younger, and it's thought that's due to the influence of fast food and perhaps higher stress levels. But perhaps most importantly, and I don't think this is widely known outside Nepal, until recently, Sherpas had no say in government. For example, there's not a single Sherpa MP. And it still remains to be seen whether a recently introduced structure with some local representation will work. I think it's fair comment to say that locally expectations aren't high. So whilst the world knows about high altitude Sherpa guides and porters, that's only a small part of their story.
The culture itself is very fragile now. The previous king considered Nepal as a one nation, and he didn't have the understanding of cultural rights, which had a very negative impact on indigenous peoples like Sherpa culture. We became a federal country. Now we are exercising how can Sherpa language and culture be recognized and maintained in the local governance system. Sherpa people in the Western world is understood as a strong porter, someone who carry very strong load to the mountains, but that's totally wrong. Sherpa people is an ethnic group, so it is a people.
This is money wall. This is very, very important for our culture. So it's been over 500-600 years old. So generation in generation, we want to preserve this money wall. People brought these slates from on the mountain, and they carved this money wall for the memories of people who passed away. Nobody can carve this money wall anymore.
Sherpa culture is okay. Chidim, thamada. Man, chedi or important di singila kadi.
His main concern losing the culture. Now is more and more people going out of village. They're going to live in Kathmandu or somewhere else. So not many people wants to work hard in the fields. We should teach the younger generation to be not forgetting the culture song, languages. You can learn other words, but keep your own language much as you can.
Ethnic group like Sherpas are still considered as a second-class citizen because we are not able to penetrate the government bureaucracy or the political circle. First of all, we are a minority group where our numbers is not that great. Then there is an issue of language. In our country, Nepali is the national language. There are people who speak Nepali as their mother tongue, but our mother tongue is Sherpa language. So when you are sitting for an interview for a position, the differences between those original Nepali speaker and us who speak Nepali as a second language, there is a big difference. From my perspective, the language is very, very important. That's part of our identity, part of our culture. The really worrying thing is that the language is disappearing very, very fast among the younger generations because of the education system we have. If the language is not there, if you can't speak, then in my definition, you are not a Sherpa.
So I hope that's given you at least an introduction to the Sherpas who live in Fortsey. I'm hugely grateful that the personal commitment shown by James and Tashi Lama has enabled me to work with them and facilitate them telling their own story. I'm absolutely thrilled that the film is now reaching audiences right across Europe and further beyond. And COVID permitting, we plan to return next year and bring that story up to date. And finally, a positive note. James has secured funding to help rebuild the village school. It was severely damaged in the earthquake of 2015. And Pemberita spoke at the start of this presentation about his dream of running water rather than the few standpipes they currently have. Well, money's been raised for that too. Plenty to think about, and I hope lots to talk about too. So, over to you. Thanks.